Howdy Patriots, welcome back to the Progressive Playbook. I am your humble dealer, and last time we were looking at how, despite the FDA being a pretty strict regulatory agency, it has slipped up in several places, partially due to partnerships with pharma companies that are primarily concerned with profit. So that's the drug part of the FDA, and now we'll look at the F part, which does stand for food, though the FDA's own commissioners have been known to slip up and accidentally call their own agency the Federal Drug Administration. One of their former commissioners has said, yeah, the food program is on the back burner, and acknowledged that it is a big problem, despite the FDA being responsible for 80% of our food supply. It's pretty well known among FDA officials and food advocates that the FDA's resources are far more towards regulating drugs. But if we're so strict on ensuring the safety of drugs, why don't we hold a similar standard for foods? Because there's some pretty severe risk if we don't. 2/3 of all Americans are overweight, and over half of those people are obese.
Chances of having a stroke are 64% higher. Heart disease, 50% higher. Type 2 diabetes, as much as 20 times higher. And the risk of being on TLC, 100 times higher.
We've known for decades that there's a direct link between obesity and sugar, found in all sorts of processed foods that are intentionally designed to be addictive. And it's all over the food shelves, not just in the US, but everywhere in the world. Excessive sugar is almost like the modern day cigarettes in how damaging it can be, but also in how much corporate interests have tried to muddy the waters. Companies like Coca-Cola have spent millions of dollars to spread misinformation, to downplay or downright deny that link between diet and obesity. They just said, hey, you should just exercise more. And they fund research with the agenda of coming to this conclusion. Sugar is everywhere, like in these commercials from the 90s.
Crunchy and milk, part of this good nutritious breakfast.
I grew up seeing these commercials all the time. And I used to think I was severely undereating or not getting my nutrients in because I couldn't eat that much food for breakfast. Oh, but don't skip breakfast. That's the most important meal of the day. No, it's not. Who told you that? Because that slogan comes from a very effective campaign from religious fanatics and bacon and cereal lobbyists. It has permeated culture so thoroughly. When I lived in Hong Kong and I told people I don't eat breakfast, so many people came up to me and said, that doesn't sound healthy. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And look at the foods they put on the breakfast table. Breads, milk, sugary orange juice. You'll find these same foods laid out in every commercial from back then. Recently, the FDA has been trying to install regulations around what can be marketed under the Healthy Choice brand, to which processed food companies complain about it being a restriction on their freedom of speech. This is the point at which I freely admit I am not a free speech absolutist, especially to corporations. We are constantly bombarded with misinformation, and most people are too busy to look up every single brand of every single product. In what world are SpaghettiOs considered healthy for kids? Look at this, 3 grams of fiber. Yeah, and 35 grams of total carbs.
Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs!
You know how we have these gnarly pictures of cigarette packets warning you of the dangers of smoking? Maybe we should have this guy on every SpaghettiOs can. And while to this day the FDA has done nothing to reel in the excessive sugar these food manufacturers are putting in their food, they've at least tried to do something about the salt. Recognizing that reducing sodium intake by 40% over the next decade could reduce hypertension and save 500,000 lives, the FDA, being the tough guys they are, have asked food manufacturers if they would kindly reduce the amount of salt they put in their food. To which I'm sure every food manufacturer was like, yeah, sure, because I want to make less money. So that's sugar and salt, but what about other additives we know nothing about? There's a loophole in the law that allows food manufacturers to deem additives generally recognized as safe, and lets them put these ingredients in their food without even telling the FDA. This rule was designed back in the day so that common ingredients like vinegar and salt didn't have to go through a long FDA safety review process, but since then companies have added thousands of ingredients to the food and supplements we consume without telling the FDA. So one example is lupin, which is a legume like peanuts, and people with peanut allergies can also have reactions to lupin, but manufacturers sometimes put it in their food anyway without adequate warning. Another one is potassium bromate, which is used to strengthen bread in the US, but it's also linked to cancer, so it's banned in Europe.
It's not just potassium bromate, but many other chemicals and substances that are banned here in Europe over health concerns, but considered safe by the FDA.
Believe it or not, I'm actually not in favor of completely closing down this loophole. I think there should be a list of ingredients that are known to be safe, so you don't have to go through this long approval process. I think that's much more efficient. But the problem is that whenever there's a new ingredient, getting that ingredient on this list also takes at least 2 years, sometimes even a decade. So I get why food manufacturers would just carry on without reporting it. There doesn't seem to be any legal repercussions. I'd say the answer is to increase the FDA funding specifically to do an adequate job of food and supplement regulation, including timely updates of that list of ingredients that are generally recognized as safe. Okay, so far we've been talking about this framework where I'm liking complete separation of powers and our taxpayer money going towards funding the Food and Drug Administration to properly regulate food and drug companies who are innovating to bring us new food and drugs. This same flow works for Medicare for All, where we call upon the government to cover health costs for private doctors to give us medical care. I want to take this framework and map it onto the political compass, which may look familiar to some of you. Here we can see the role government plays with respect to corporations as well as to us as citizens. The y-axis has to do with the government's involvement with personal liberties, where further up means more government regulation while further down is less regulation. The x-axis is about government involvement with economic freedoms, which is largely tied to corporations. Further left means more regulation, while further right means less regulation. There isn't inherently a right or wrong. In fact, if you go too hard in any one direction, you get some pretty extreme forms of government. It's really best to go policy by policy, issue by issue, to figure out where we stand, and then over time you may realize you generally favor one particular position on this quadrant. Thus far we've been looking at the x-axis, and it's pretty clear that when it comes to public health and safety, I'm in favor of the government regulating corporations in manufactured drugs, processed foods, and what products can achieve certain labels like organic or healthy choice. Now we're going to look at the y-axis, where I have a different view between drugs and food. I think most people would agree you shouldn't be allowed to go and take whatever drug you want whenever you want. We have a system of over-the-counter drugs and prescription drugs that require an authority figure, a doctor's consent. So I know I call myself the dealer, but for drugs, I'd probably fall higher on the y-axis. But let's explore food a bit more, because we generally do have access to any foods we want to buy. The UK proposed a ban on promotions like buy one get one free on anything considered high fat, sugar, or salt. And this time the counter argument is that people should have the right to choose. And I think it's a bit of a goofy argument because sure, promotions would be banned, but nothing's stopping you from buying the product. My alma mater is Virginia Tech. We are proud of routinely having some of the best rated campus food in the entire country. In my first year at VT, they did an experiment at the buffet style dining halls. They wanted to see what would happen if you took away all the trays. What they found was that this reduced food waste by 38%, which was over 1,500 pounds of food in just 1 week. So they got rid of the trays, and when we walked into those dining halls, we still had the freedom to eat whatever we wanted and however much of it. If you wanted, in theory, you could go around and collect 10 plates of food from 10 different stalls, but the point was that you could only carry what you could with your bare hands at any given time, and this made us all conscious of how much we were eating. A similar idea in 2012-2013, Mayor Mike Bloomberg tried to ban the sale of large sugary drinks over 16 ounces in New York City, a policy which ultimately got struck down, but I don't think it's a bad idea for a similar reason. You can still consume the equivalent of a big gulp if you really want. You just have to do it in multiple cups. The policy is designed to simply make it less convenient. It's like a minor intervention. It's like somebody gently asking you, "Hey man, do you really need this much sugar right now?" If the spirit of the regulation is consumer protection, to protect us from false advertising and misinformation, or to provide this sort of check, I'm generally for it, especially if it's to help us become a healthier population. However, I do understand the slippery slope behind this. I feel like this could lead to a lot of little rules that would each only marginally improve health. We don't want to create too many rules that would use more taxpayer money to enforce, and we certainly don't want to unnecessarily create rules that would restrict the freedom of individuals. On top of that, when you go down a more authoritarian route, you are assuming the authority knows what they're doing and that they have your best interests. In the 80s and 90s, every kid, including me, was taught the food pyramid for having a balanced diet. This was promoted by the US government, it was on the USDA website, but it was crafted by corporate influence. The dairy industry took a whole section and, oh, look at the size of grains at the base of the pyramid. It's because starting in the 1970s, Nixon promoted the growth of crops like corn, wheat, and soy to solve a food crisis, and we overproduced. Probably isn't much better today, as 9 out of the 20 panelists who helped create the US nutritional guidelines have ties to Nestle, Pfizer, Coca-Cola, the National Egg Board. But I also don't trust the government to always get it right, and to not be influenced by corporate lobbying. So far I've shared my opinions on how we can give people healthcare access when they're sick or hurt, and also how to keep Americans safe with food and drug policy. In the next video, we're going to go straight into the core of the health core by understanding the deepest underlying challenges we have to root out, and how this core links to all the other upcoming cores. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out that one, and if you're trusting my voice on this platform, be sure to hit me with that LSB, like, subscribe, and bell, and I'll deal ya the next one.